Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podblog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Training and Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome back, everyone, to the fifth episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Today, I've decided to re-air a episode that was recorded several months ago here in this studio for the Jan Broberg Show podcast. Jan asked me to not only be the consultant for her show, but also a co-host, and in doing so asked if I would be willing to be interviewed so that her audience could learn a little bit more about myself and my background and experience as a law enforcement investigator, some of my education and experiences, and I agreed, and she aired that, so it's on her podcast, but I wanted also to give my audience that same opportunity of getting to know me a little bit better and learning a little bit more about who I am and what my experiences are. So let's get right into it, and I'll see you on the other side.
Hey, I'm really excited to be sitting here with a friend of mine, Dave Markel. Hi.
Hi, Janny.
It's really exciting to be at this point where we're both on a similar path.
It's quite the honor for me to be here.
Thanks. And for me, it feels like it's the path of experience. And for you, it's been a lifelong career choice and path now. And I'd love for you to explain a little bit about who you are and what your pursuits are now, but also where your background has taken you to this point.
Absolutely. I'm Dave Markel. I'm a retired police detective. I worked for the Lafayette, Colorado Police Department from 1983 to 2001. So almost 20 years. Most of that as a detective, did some patrol work too. But I took early retirement to start my own training and consulting business, and I've been doing that ever since. So it's been about 20 years of that in that capacity. Part of that has been the privilege of having worked for the U.S. Army as a highly qualified expert and got to work with some amazing people who kind of steered me in the direction of getting into the neuroscience of the brain when it's in trauma. So how to understand what victims of interpersonal violence are going through on a neuro basis, as well as how that manifests in behavior, in memory, in thought processes, so that as investigators, we can ask questions of victims and survivors in such a way that we're not re-traumatizing them and completely allowing them to talk about their experience in ways that feel comfortable to them. So that basically what I've been teaching is how to talk to people, not just in an interview setting, but just in conversation like this, how to talk to people and let them have control of the conversation, regardless of what we're talking about. And you just do that through understanding what it means to be trauma-informed and knowing how the brain reacts to trauma. I've been doing that for about 10 years now.
Wow. So is that the consulting service is for various organizations like police departments or for people that are, I mean, you said you started at kind of the U.S. Army was the first time that maybe you were doing that, and then it's grown into a consulting business of its own, but all within this category or this I don't want to call it a genre, but trauma being the core piece of your consulting.
Yes, and helping people who are talking to survivors and victims, as well as family members, and the actual victims and survivors themselves have asked for training and education that I provide to them even on why they are acting the way they're acting after an interpersonal violence episode or trauma, or why they're thinking the way they're thinking, or why 20, 30, 40, 50 years after the assault, they're still having issues and dealing with how to cope with that trauma. So there's a huge audience out there for this type of education. And it's not just law enforcement. It's Title IX investigators on university and college campuses. It's nurse examiners. It's medical personnel, social workers, and mental health providers, as well as human resources and even corporate executives get a lot of benefit from this type of education on how to interpersonally react with people that have been through some sort of interpersonal violence trauma. And for the most part, that's all of us.
Right.
I don't know anybody who hasn't been through some sort of trauma in their life.
Absolutely. So how do you decide what clients or what organizations that you want to specifically work with?
They call me and we see if what I have to offer is a fit. And I have never turned down anyone yet in terms of what I have to offer in terms of education and training and assistance. And that has even developed into me starting my own podcast because I've had so many victims and survivors who've said, we need this stuff. We need to be able to have a platform, which is exactly what you're doing. It's providing this platform for victims and survivors to be able to tell their story, and that's therapeutic in and of itself. Even though I'm not a therapist and I don't dispense therapy, just talking to people in ways that make them feel comfortable about their own trauma experience is therapeutic.
Seems to me like when you can put a label on something, or you can name a certain type of abuse tactic or trauma tactic, sometimes just knowing that it has a name makes you feel empowered. I know for myself, when I started to understand brainwashing terms and terminology, all of a sudden I could go, oh, that's what he did. And oh, that's what he did. And by doing that, it took it out of the unmanageable form for me of just feeling thrown to the abuse to a place of empowerment to understand what had happened, which literally helped to release things as we went along. So we're talking about a couple of different things here. We're talking about trauma and surviving trauma, and then how do you come out of trauma, first of all, in a way that you can help yourself progress because you're having issues. And I would imagine for most people, the number one issue, they're issues of trust. Trust was broken because almost all of these traumatic experiences that we've suffered is not usually from the hands of someone we don't know, but someone we do know, often someone we trust, someone we love, someone that's supposed to love us. And then when we're abused and traumatized, that trust is so completely demolished. I know that for me was the number one tactic that my predator used, was to build trust. Can you speak to that a little more?
Sure, absolutely. And it's very interesting that you've used some of the terminology that you've used, because when you talk about trust and the way trust is gained, if you think about it just for a second about who we trust and who we don't trust, a lot of it has to do with likability. Even when we first meet someone, if we like someone, the way they look, the way they talk, the way they engage with us, the eye contact, all of these external factors help us make some internal decisions about their insides and the way they think and the way they act. And if we like them, we tend to start building a trust for them almost immediately. If we don't like them, we start building walls and fences.
And that's just based on literally a first
Impression.
meeting, a first impression, an engaging, charming, happy, welcoming personality can immediately make us feel, oh, I already trust this person because I like them. I like the way they look, the way they act. I get that. I see that.
You can think about any of the serial predators. Ted Bundy comes to mind, and how he used to approach his victims in grocery store parking lots when they'd come out with bags and stuff, and he'd also sometimes be carrying stuff. And he would say, hey, can you help me just for a second? I've hurt my shoulder, or I've got a broken arm. He used to walk around in a sling. He would do things that would kind of involve some empathy bait.
Yeah.
So that
empathy
people would,
bait.
so that
That's
people
a good
would
term.
Yeah, baiting. Yeah.
Baiting.
So that people would like, oh yeah, sure. I got what can I help you with? Well, I've got my groceries over here next to my car, but with my arm I can't lift them up into my car. Could you help me at least just get them from the ground into the car, or whatever he used, or whatever he'd say specifically. They would go with him. And once they were near where he was, it was easy to just abduct them, take them on, push them on into his vehicle and leave.
Because you often think, well, my first thought when you started with that was, oh, well, he's going to offer to help somebody else.
He would do that too sometimes.
Right.
Yes.
But it seems like we're a little more cautious. At least women have had enough, scary stranger danger stories to go, oh, no, 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 I got this, don't touch my groceries. I can handle it. But it's interesting that he would induce that empathy card to again, gain a level of trust, because I like that term, empathy bait. That's a good one.
And if they're good looking, which he was,
Yeah.
or the least bit attractive, but if their personality on top of that is attractive, if it's kind, if it's open, if the person automatically starts a conversation, or initially starts a conversation in friendly terms and non-threatening ways, people tend to let their guard down. And the more interaction that goes on, that guard comes down even further. So you can, as a predator mindset, pull down people's defenses rather quickly.
So in our case, where we met this man at church that we attended, and he was a family man, a wife, 5 children. He looked just as clean cut and, in a place of worship as everybody else did.
Yeah.
Immediately, I think when you enter a place where you already find it to be a place of trust and morality and good teachings and ethics, that also must make an impact, like where you meet someone, not
Sure.
just them, all on their own, but the location also tends to build trust immediately, correct?
No question. If he were to have lurked in alleyways and waiting for people to walk by, and then kind of come out of the shadows and start talking to you, your defenses are going to be a whole lot different, and your response is going to be a lot different than if you get to know them at church.
Yeah.
In a slow, relaxed, comfortable environment, especially in a house of worship, or where the commonality is that
It's an immediate
location and
bind.
the whole morale base and things like that is the same.
What are the locations where a predator would be most likely to be in plain sight and immediately basically liked because they're in that location? And they don't have to try very hard. They assume, and as everybody in that location assumes, hey, we're all in this same location, doing this same sort of worship together. So definitely, I think churches and congregations are one. What are some other locations?
Well, I think there's a misconception about that, in the sense that people think, well, if they did it at church, then that's a comfortable place for them. But it can be almost anywhere. I mean, obviously, schools, and if we're talking children, then a lot of these predators become scoutmasters, or Girl Scout leaders, or Boy Scout leaders, or Cub Scouts, and schools. You see a lot of teachers who are predators, and that can be in elementary school all the way up through university attendance. So when we're talking about this, it's not so much the locale, although that can tend to bolster that trust, but it's more the manipulation tactics that a perpetrator would use, no matter where they're at. They seem to be smarter than most victims, the general public, who aren't predators, are, in terms of how those tactics are used. And you brought up the idea earlier in terms of trust, of recognizing that a lot of these people are people that we know. And statistically, it's been proven that when we talk about stranger rape versus acquaintance rape, the statistics are that about 85 to 95% of sexual perpetration happens at the hands of someone that the victim knows. Even if it's slightly, they know them, they have some level of trust for them. It's rare that you have the stranger danger of the person jumping out from the bushes in a park or hiding behind a dumpster or whatever. And that's a tactic in and of itself, is that predators know that if they get to know their target and focus on the manipulation tools that they're going to use with that target, it doesn't really matter where they're at, what that location is. And the other aspect to that is to recognize that while we say, this was someone I knew, this was someone I trusted, this is someone I built a relationship with, in reality, what we're building that relationship with is that person that we see in public.
The persona.
The persona of what a friend of mine calls the first persona, the persona that we show the public, what we let everybody see. And that persona is guarded, and it's not what's
The real
inside.
person,
Right. And so once an assault occurs, you often hear victims say, they became a person I didn't even know. And that's when they become the stranger. They're as unknown as that person that jumps out from behind the bush, because we never saw that part of the person.
Right.
So that person is a stranger. That person is unknown to almost everybody.
Right. So how do you help people understand that it wasn't their fault? Because that, I think, was one of the things that was the most devastating almost for me when the documentary came out, Abducted in Plain Sight, that so many people looked at my parents as if, well, they knew, or they were complicit, or I wouldn't have done that, or I would have known this or that. And I'm like, you wouldn't, though. He was so good at that persona, at that helpful Henry, at that, church crying from the pulpit or whatever, that I'm like, no, they didn't know. They literally didn't. And they weren't stupid. And so the only way that my story might help someone else is if they can see themselves in it. Not the disconnect of, well, I know more, and well, that was in the 70s. That doesn't help anybody.
Right. When I was working with the military, a great example to teach people about that would be to ask people that we were training and talking to about this very subject, what would you do as a soldier, male or female, as a soldier who's been trained in combat tactics, and you're in theater, you're in the war zone, and the person you're rooming with or in a foxhole with starts to sexually assault you, what would you do? And you get so many people who say, well, I'd shoot him, or I'd beat the crap out of him, or I'd do whatever I had to do to make it stop. They think that's what they would do. They hope that's what they would do. But the reality is, once a trauma starts, once an interpersonal attack from somebody you think you know starts, and you're realizing that that person isn't somebody that you really know, that you're seeing an aspect of them all of a sudden that you don't know what you're going to do.
Right.
It's just as though you were trained as a special forces soldier in how to react to torture, how to react to bullets coming at you. And they train it over and over and over again. And you're in constant combat training when you're a soldier or an airman or in the Navy. And what happens is that training starts to take over how you react. But the reality is, when you're actually in the situation that is life-threatening, that training can just fade away almost instantaneously. It doesn't always, but in many cases it does. And so we've had special forces personnel who curl up in the fetal position and freeze and cry and freak out because they just are scared. And they had the same training as somebody right next to them who does exactly what they were trained to do and fights back and keeps their wits about them and maintains. But even then, and we could get into this sometime too, that they still have repercussions from that trauma.
Sure.
But to say, I know what I would do if anybody ever did that, and for those people who make accusations to you and to your family members that they were complicit or that they knew or that they reacted incorrectly, they are making judgments that they themselves have absolutely no idea how they would react in that same situation, because we don't know how our brains are going to react. And it's all amygdala based. It's the part of the brain that is there to protect us from danger. And what that danger response is to survive. We'll do whatever it takes to survive, because that's the brain's number one objective and goal. And so oftentimes our responses surprise us because we didn't know that we were going to respond in a certain way. And that's where trust comes in. So the people who are doing this perpetration are building the trust as best they can, so that when the perpetration starts, the victim is so unprepared for what is coming that they do freeze, or they become so afraid or so overwhelmed that they don't know how to react and they don't want to talk about it.
Right, or they go along with it because they're afraid for other, at least in my experience with, a grown man, taking me, and of course there's a whole story around that, but the reality was I was so afraid for my family's lives, the threats that were made and all of that. So when you really trust someone, and then he even set himself up to remain in a position of trust throughout those kidnappings, because it was as if a third party had kidnapped both of us,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
So you look back and you think, oh gosh, I wasn't a stupid 12-year-old. I was maybe a little bit innocent. I grew up in a community where we didn't lock our doors at night and everybody knew everybody, and neighborhood parties a couple times a year, barbecues, and 30% of the people in my neighborhood I went to church with, and the other ones we were at the university football game with or whatever. It's like, you really can see how easy it is for someone to infiltrate that already existing communal trust feeling that is already super palatable.
That is so correct.
And super palpable. Like, that is the community.
Yep.
And so why would anybody even have any reason to even take a second look or to ever even think that about someone? We just didn't think that about people.
Yeah.
My parents didn't know what a pedophile was. They'd heard of a child molester, but that kind of trust that the community already has is something that that person is playing on. That trust in not only an individual, engagement, but also with just kind of the whole community being like
Absolutely.
that.
Whatever was presented to make you mistrust him.
Right.
Nothing.
Exactly.
Nothing was ever presented that would make you go, I need to really be careful of this person. I don't want to be alone with this person. Now, there are people who may have been through other experiences that see that kind of thing that become leery of that. But like you're saying, for the most part, our intuitive socialization from a very young age is to be accepting and loving of people. Treat others as you would want them to treat you.
Right.
And that socialization starts from the moment we're born.
Absolutely. The golden rule.
Absolutely.
And everybody can relate to that.
How we're touched by our parents, how we gain attention from them, and how what our crying response is from parents and siblings and things along those lines.
Right. It really makes me think about the fact that this man that, infiltrated basically our family, and each individual built a special relationship with each individual. Like, hey, Bob, we're downtown. He's a furniture store owner. My dad owns a flower shop. Let's go to lunch. Let's take a break and go to lunch. And so there's this special relationship here when Mom and Dad aren't together.
Right.
Hey, Marianne, I'm stopping by the house. I'll pick up all the kids. I'll take my 3 boys that were going to the same schools as me and my 2 younger sisters. We're all the same age. I'll take all the kids to school. I know Bob goes early. That'll mean you don't have to drive so much. And how you doing? And, oh, what are you working on over there? And just because she's alone. you know?
Absolutely.
So he figures out all these things. So when you're building trust, he's coming to the back door and doing what my dad had done since we were little tiny kids, which is using one of his isms, we call them. Dad and my Uncle Dick, they were identical twins, they had a whole language of their own, and it was based on people they knew in business, and they could put on the voices of some old lady, you know, and talk about her, and oh darling, what's, you know, they were so funny, and they had all these little sayings like,
Hmm.
you know, isn't it grand? Life is grand, and so many things that when my dad would sometimes refer to one of his little girls, he'd say, "Okay, doll of sweet, whatever you say," or "All right, precious jewel, woman of destiny, whatever you think is the best thing to do, let's do that." He had these little sayings, and so Berchtold started opening our back door and saying, "Hey, Brobergs, it's a great day." Just very much in the same vein as what my dad had done by playing the piano. You know, it was the Sousa March, you know, dun 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 dun. That was our alarm clock in the morning. That's how the girls got out of bed. Dad started playing the piano. That's the kind of home I lived in. And then we were up, and Dad would kind of help with breakfast, and then he'd be out the door, and Mom would finish up, and then here'd come Berchtold, you know, da 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 da, open the door. Hey, Brobergs, it's gonna be a great day, and everybody comes running. He just, I think, I don't know if that was normal, because from what we heard later after the fact, he was, you know, deeply depressed. And that's what he used as sort of his bait, is the empathy card again. I see that now.
Yeah. Well, and absolutely, it's not just baiting or manipulating the specific target. It's manipulation of everyone in that situation, in
In
that
that orbit.
environment,
Yes.
exactly, in order to make the target more susceptible and more vulnerable. And that's all he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing when he was doing these things. If you were to sit down and talk to him on these terms, he wouldn't be able to talk like you and I are in terms of what that manipulation meant. He just knew through observation and getting to know you and seeing what you and your family were doing in church and what you and your family were doing for work and how the morning worked, and kind of infiltrating slowly,
Yeah.
but knowing that for him there was some sort of payoff.
Right.
So that's why I say that a lot of recognition needs to be made in terms of the general public, that we need to be more enlightened. We need to be more educated on what it means to trust someone, what that trust is built on, and how that trust can be manipulated and used against us to harm us.
Right. And what would you say would be maybe one or two, maybe three things to build your own ability to discern, or to really look, or to step back? What would that look like?
I'm not real sure that you can say that. I think it's an individual personality process. Like for me, being raised the way I was, which sounds very similar to the way you were raised, very trusting, very religious, raised in a family that went to church all the time, and was myself protected from certain aspects of the world by my parents, who didn't want me to see certain things, who didn't want me to experience harm or harshness from those outside of our family or our close friends. And so that kind of put me into this naivete that I carried into adulthood, so that when I became a police officer, almost didn't get hired because that naivete was evident to those who were interviewing me for the position. But my drive, my determination, my intelligence level at passing the test, and my psychological eval was enough that, yeah, you're a good candidate. We can take that naivete away from you by training you and helping you understand how manipulation works. What it was for me was a rude awakening. that learning curve was
Yeah.
like a ton of bricks hitting me upside the head as to what the criminal world was like. And for anyone who's been in law enforcement for any period of time, you learn that it becomes a natural reaction that our response to the criminal element is that we feel like about 90% of society is criminal, and a very small percent, like maybe 10, maybe even less percent, is non-criminal. And those are the people that we know really well, our family members. They're not criminals. I know to trust them, but everybody else I don't. And so there's this cynical kind of aspect that kind of comes through time. And what you have to guard against is the reality is that only about 10 to 15% of society is criminal, and the other 80, 85% is not.
Yeah, that's nice to know.
So it's hard, though, to make that realization and be as trusting as probably we should be. On the other hand, there's those who never make that realization. And again, like your parents, your siblings, yourself, were so gullible because of all of that, that element of cynicism wasn't there.
Right.
There's been a lot of studies on how we think of and conceive of criminal mindset. And when it comes down to a law enforcement perspective or someone who's working in criminal justice fields, it basically boils down to someone who's ever committed a crime. But there are a few people who commit one crime and never do it again. Those are a very, very small percentage of the criminal element. Most criminals commit a crime, find out that it was easy, that they weren't caught, and commit more crime. And then sometimes even if they do get caught, the payoff to them was satisfying enough or rewarding enough in what it was that they did criminally that they'll repeat it. And then there's another aspect whose brains are just damaged, who don't think like most people and don't have any feeling at all about whether or not they're committing crimes and will do whatever they feel like doing. Sociopaths. So there's just this wide spectrum of the criminal element.
And I think that's you would consider to be a criminal.
And I think that's important to understand when we're talking about trust too, is that there's just this huge spectrum of criminality and how that all works and who's committing crimes and who's not.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about, if we're talking about sex offenders, especially from my point of view, the children that are targeted and that are, traumatized, sexually assaulted and abused is especially heinous in my mind as far as criminals go. How would you maybe categorize, I know that there must be a contingency of pedophilia that maybe they don't act on it, but we only pretty much know the ones that do for the most part, the criminal pedophile. What's the scale? Are they all sociopaths? Are they repeat offenders?
That's a great question, but almost impossible to answer. What I can address is that about 5% of the criminal element that I just mentioned is as being 10 to 15% of the population. About 5% of those are sex offenders of some kind or another. But the overlap of sex crimes is about 80%. So if, as an example, what I'm talking about is that if someone is collecting child pornography, downloading it onto their computer, that's probably not the only sex crime they're committing. They're probably a peeping Tom, too. They may be taking their own pictures, which are criminal acts in and of themselves. Both of those are separate criminal acts. And of those, some of them may also be exposing themselves. And then some of those may be touching people in crowded places on purpose, like buses and at baseball games where the whole crowd is trying to get into their seats at the same time and you're around a lot of people. And so there's frottage, where people are actually touching other people on purpose for sexual gratification. How do we know which of those are sociopaths and which are just, I don't know, the word isn't normal, but non-sociopathic sex offenders? That's almost impossible to say, because the only way we are measuring this in terms of that aspect of criminality, sociopath versus non, are by those who have been caught
Right.
and imprisoned. And those are the study subjects. So we don't really know what percentage or what the number is of a population of sex offenders who are sociopathic versus non-sociopathic, because the ones that we're studying are the ones that are caught and imprisoned and will willingly be participants in study groups or in as subjects of a research project, for instance.
Right.
But the ones who are caught and incarcerated is such a small percentage. In fact, it's less than 1% of all the criminals that are committing sexual crimes.
Wow.
And so we don't have a lot of information out there available to us. And much of what we get is just through empirical data and experiential data that people can address and talk to based on questions that we ask people who we've arrested. But just because you're arrested for a sex crime doesn't mean you're going to go to prison for that or even serve any time in jail.
Well, that was certainly true in the case of my predator, who literally served less than 45 days in jail and went to a mental hospital, which is where he found the mother of a 9-year-old who was a psychiatric nurse of the next victim after me.
Absolutely.
And he
sure.
found her because he was court ordered to go to a mental institution and get help. And of course, he was then fine, but he had already identified another little girl.
Yeah.
So, what would you say would be some tactics for someone like my predator who got out of jail, basically, or got through, 2 kidnappings, 4 years of sexual rape and assault, which I had not confessed to, of course, at that time as a child, and many things that I think today would have told that story. We have a coposcope, we have certain, medical ways of seeing harm that we didn't back in the 70s, but still, how do people escape that? If only 1% of all of the sexual criminals, predators, are actually incarcerated, and then when they even are incarcerated, they get out of jail, how does that happen? How is the system not working?
Look at the Stanford swimmer on the swim team. I can't remember his name, Brock something, who was caught in the act of a rape, a full-out penetration rape by passersby who saw this happening at a party near the campus. And he was arrested on the spot, charged, tried, convicted, and a judge sentenced him to 3 months when the prosecutor was asking for 14 years. So how does that happen? My response to that is that we live in a rape culture. Our society is a rape culture society. And by that I mean that because of our lack of understanding and lack of education and naivete, and because there are so many predators out there who are expert at what they're doing and know what to do to not be caught, we as a society are lending a hand to the predator mentality and to the predator activity.
Right.
A lot of it has to do with lack of understanding of the predator mindset, but a lot of it also has to do with the fact that these people know how to manipulate judges and juries also. And so in the instance of the Stanford swim team member who was convicted at sentencing, brought in several people to testify on his behalf of his character. He's a great guy. He's a wonderful student. He's a great swimmer, and he's helping Stanford. And he's got a future ahead of him. Why would we harm that? He just made a mistake. And the reality of it is that most sexual predators don't just do one sexual assault, one and done.
Right.
Most of them have multiple victims.
And that's the thing that I think is really hard for people sometimes to understand as well, especially when it's someone in the family and you find out or something but your solution is usually just to keep your children away from, that particular uncle or grandpa
Right.
or whatever, because
Right.
you literally have no idea where to go with that. And a lot of the Jan Broberg Foundation, I think, will be able to help with the resources of legal advice and where do you go and how do you go forward when it's somebody that you know and your whole family's going to be blown apart by outing them. That trust has been generational. The trust is a generational thing. It's the family name. Oh my gosh, we certainly can't soil the family name. We'll just do this hush hush and just kind of sweep it under the carpet and keep our kids away from them,
Right.
but keep the family intact, the whole big family system. It's like, I'm like, that's like what a gang does. Like the individual doesn't matter. It's just the whatever the big gang wants you to do. So what if
Absolutely.
you get shot? And I'm like, that's like family systems that literally, but people don't know where to go or what to do.
Well, it goes back to what we started off with, and that is that our brains as humans don't like to face harmful, damaging, hurtful information. We avoid it at all cost. And so much of the reason we're a rape culture is due to that fact that we don't want to face the reality that there are so many sex offenders out there, and that even though that percentage is relatively low in the realm of criminals, that 5% have literally, most of them, hundreds of victims. I arrested a grandpa who was 78 years old who was caught fondling one of his grandchildren. And his wife basically told him, "You will turn yourself in or I will leave you." And he came in and he said, "Yeah, I sexually assaulted one of my grandchildren." And we started talking. I fortunately had quite a bit of education by then about what sexual perpetration was all about. And we started talking about, well, let's talk about some of the other people who've been victims of your sexual attack or your predatory behavior. And we did the math. And he started when he was about 14, and now he's 78. And he couldn't remember how many people he had sexually assaulted in grade school, middle school, and high school. But he said it was in the hundreds. And most of it was just fondling, that frottage kind of thing where you rub up against somebody, make it look like an accident, but really you're doing it for sexual gratification. And then he went into the Navy, and he said, I probably sexually assaulted over 100 sailors, male and female, in the 4 years I was in the Navy. And I got out of the Navy, and I went to school at a university, and I continued sexually assaulting people that trusted me, girlfriends, male friends. And we just started estimating with low estimates and came to the conclusion that he had sexually assaulted probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 people for that time.
Unbelievable. What if his wife would have said, no matter what, you will turn yourself in, or I will turn you in, instead of I will leave you? Because I'll bet a lot of people opt for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then they go unreported.
I would guess that that's probably true.
And that, I believe, is also why there must be so many that are never brought into, the criminal justice system at all, because the people around them are either scared to turn them in, or they have their own confirmational bias going so strongly that I'm sure something's going on over there, but I couldn't possibly see it because my focus is over there. So I'm not going to see that because I need to stay in the realm of I'm married to this person. This person is the father of my children, or this person is the leading attorney in town, or that my husband just got Teacher of the Year last year, like somebody here in our community.
Exactly.
That was eventually exposed for his thousands of child pornography pictures, and then found out how many students and children he had himself exposed. Just basically the same list that you just went through. And this guy had Teacher of the Year awards more than once during his tenure.
It's easy for me to just revert back to the terminology I just referred to, and that is rape culture. Everything that you're talking about is societally based culture. Don't talk about it. Don't bring it up. It's going to hurt the family. It's going to cause more damage than it's going to solve. It's going to make me look bad. It's going to make my family look bad. I have a relative whose brother sexually assaulted her, and she didn't tell anybody until 50 years after it happened because she was scared of what that would do to the family relations. That's rape culture. That's our culture saying, don't tell anybody because it's better if you don't. And that's what the Me Too movement was all about. It's a victims and survivors saying enough.
Right.
We've got to start talking about this. We've got to change the culture from a rape culture to a culture of reporting and recognizing that sexual assault and rape is so much more prevalent than we could dream possible.
Right, and then we're willing to admit. And to do that, there has to be some system of support to become that reporting culture, because often I've also heard stories of, I tried to report, I didn't know what to do, I couldn't get any support. After 7 years of trying to put my ex-husband in jail for raping my 2 little boys, I finally gave up. I'm now a single mom trying to keep my 2 sons developing and healthy and trying to unharm the harm that's been done by counseling, by all these things. But I don't have a whole lot of resources, and I'm trying to also put this person in jail, and I don't know the right questions to ask to the police, and I don't have any more money, and I don't have any more time because now I work full time and my boys need counseling. And what do you choose? You choose to just give up after 7 years.
Absolutely.
And
It's so common.
I'm not blaming her. I'm not having any kind of
No
like, there's
judgment
no
on
shame
that.
or judgment on that. It's like we have to go from this rape culture to a culture of support, believing, first of all, believing the victims, then also helping them. They're in the damaged state. They're in the, how am I going to recover from what's happened to me? How do we possibly expect them, especially when they're not telling, sometimes 10, 15, 20. Aren't you the person that told us that the average woman who is raped, it takes 7 years for her to report that rape?
Yep, that's true. And
That's
for
the
men, it's
statistic.
even longer.
Yeah,
because
21 years or something.
Exactly. Because of our culture,
Yeah.
right? Men don't talk about their rapes. It took me 20 some odd years to tell an audience that I was talking to about rape and encouraging that they should report their rapes incidents that happened to them to law enforcement. After 22 or 23 years, I finally admitted to an audience that I was training that I had been sexually assaulted when I was in college.
Wow.
And I don't know what made me finally feel safe enough to do that. It certainly wasn't the length of time, because now I'm telling people that I'm, training and trying to educate, that I too was doing the same thing that I'm trying to tell people not to do, and that's keep it a secret.
Right, and that's the thing. It's a lethal secret, and somehow to find that safe space, even to just tell one person, it truly is the first step towards your own personal healing and towards changing the rape culture that we've been talking about to an actual justice for the thousands of people who are affected by, rape and sexual trauma and abuse as children at any age, whether you're an adult or a child, but especially children. I think it interrupts so many pieces of their natural development that it just seems especially, it's like kicking a dog. There's nothing that makes me sadder than when I see somebody harming an animal, but is totally in love with the person that's kicking them.
Mm-hmm.
That it would do anything, and it's just that same kind of innocence, like,
right.
How does this happen? Why won't the other people around that predator that knows? Because they don't feel supported. They don't know what to do. They literally do not know what to do. My mom and dad were so brave to tell our story, to tell their mistakes, how they got led down that road, by somebody who was manipulating them like a master marionette puppeteer.
And how they too even were victimized
Yes.
by him. in a sexual way. Not only you and the manipulation that he exposed them to, but you also, but in that, they too were sexually assaulted. And this all circles back to what you said this theme is about, is trust, right? It's not only the trust issue of how perpetrators build trust to perpetrate, but it's that trust issue of what are we as survivors and victims going to do when we don't trust those who are supposed to be helping us to help us.
Right.
Because of the ramifications that come out when we tell somebody.
Right.
And in my realm of coming from law enforcement, dealing with so many law enforcement personnel who have absolutely no idea how to respond to this and would rather not, and sweep these types of cases under the rug instead of investigating them appropriately and in ways that edify and build up the victims and survivors in such a way that they feel comfortable talking about it and telling their story. So we need to learn those tactics. We need to learn how to talk to people to make them feel that element of trust.
Right.
To talk.
That they're safeguarded with their now out of the bag secret.
Right.
So that they're not going to be shamed by it further. They're not going to be harmed by telling further. They're going to be supported. They're going to have the belief and then the actions that need to follow in order for them to be able to actually have justice served.
Which is why, Jen, I'm so happy and thrilled and honored to be a part of this podcast and to help you and help your audience come to a better understanding of what it is that you went through, how you were victimized. I'm so proud of you and happy for you to be a voice for hundreds and thousands of people who've been sexually assaulted, who will hear your podcast and hear your encouragement and hear your education, your experience, to help them do what they need to do to trust and heal. Right. And that's my goal too, with what I'm doing in talking to people and training people and reaching out, is to bring justice to victims and survivors that heals them. That kind of justice, but it also helps bring justice to our perpetrators who need to be stopped in their tracks.
Right, and until there's some kind of methodology for that person to get help, I'm assuming that most of those folks were probably harmed themselves. I mean, that's my big heart answer, but at the same time, I can't allow those folks to roam the earth and have access to my kids, my grandkids, my great-grandchildren until there's a solution, until
Absolutely.
there's, the right therapies and the right, physicians and whatever it is to help everybody heal. I want everyone to be healed from their harm.
What you're doing is cathartic, and that's a good thing. You're saving lives by starting your foundation, by having a podcast, by letting your story be told in that documentary and future projects that you're willing to reach out and help people understand all of the many levels and facets of what it is to be a perpetrator and what it is to be a victim/survivor.
Right, and that's really what I appreciate that, because some people have asked me, aren't you sick of talking about your story? And I'm like, well, it's interesting because I've talked about it so much that I can really look at it as like outside of my body now. It's not affecting me like it might have. I mean, I might have times where something new comes up because a new stage of life. Oh, I'm now married. Oh, I'm now having sex. Oh, I now have a baby. Oh, I'm, whatever those things are that come to the surface throughout your life that might go, oh gosh, there's still some residual here that I got to figure out and clean up and take care of.
So good for you to bring that up, because even this aspect of your life and watching what you're doing and what you're producing through the podcast and the foundation and the exposure that you're allowing to occur is educating you. Right? You're learning new facts all the time. Right. And that helps you have a response to things that happened when you were abducted.
Right, which again is I know that's been part of my healing process. When I can put a definition on something, I can name it. All of a sudden I can go, okay, I can manage that. When it's all just swirling around inside of a person's soul and they haven't found anybody to talk to about it, they haven't taken that first step, I think that's when the most damage is happening, getting it out, even though for many years, you were functioning as a police detective, and you were helping people, and you were a breadwinner and a husband and a father, and you were doing a lot of great things in your life. And then at one point, it came out, and I'll bet you found that there were other things that came up because of that you also had to deal with, but that honestly, it was the beginning of an even more full experience as who you were as a human being, how you were going to show up in the world, who you were going to help, what you were going to do about it, because you were able to tell. And that's what whether you're 14 or you're 44 or you're 84, 94, 104, if you can do that one thing to start on your path as early as possible, you will find a lot more, maybe a lot of people out there. I think our young people are so smart, and they have so much information. And I'm like, just know that you can't trust everybody, and that what's happened to you was not your fault, and that you can come forward and you can tell someone, even if it's on our foundation site. You can leave your story. You can decide if you would like to be interviewed on a podcast with, people are at different stages of their development in this recovery. I mean, it's like recovering from alcoholism or
Absolutely.
drug use. It really is. So that's where the Jan Broberg Foundation, and having sponsors and having an online community and being able to go into a group session, where I couldn't afford that, as I'm going through another divorce and I'm schlepping around my little boy, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm still broken. I still can't figure it out. Where do I go for help? What do? I don't have any money. I don't know what to do. That's what I don't want to have happen to anybody else out there. That with this global online community of support literally will help every person find their path, find what's next in their healing, and help support them if they want to, put the perpetrator, in jail, and they won't be doing it alone.
That does it for another episode of SAS. Thanks for listening. Listen to a new episode each week, and please remember to subscribe, rate each episode, and spread the word about this important podcast, because we all know someone who's been affected by sexual assault or rape. Remember to start by believing, and let's all do our share to help bring justice to victims of rape and sexual assault. We'll talk to you next week.